I still remember the night I wrote the first line of code for what would become Nexora. It was 2:47 a.m., my coffee had gone cold hours ago, and my small studio apartment in San Jose smelled faintly of burnt solder from the prototype boards scattered across my desk. At that time, it was just me, my laptop, and an idea that felt too big for the room I was sitting in. I was a senior systems architect at a mid-sized tech firm by day, but this project, my project, was what kept me awake at night. The idea was simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. An adaptive, self-learning integration layer for enterprise systems that could reduce infrastructure costs by nearly 40% without human intervention. I knew it could change the industry. I knew it could change my life. By the time Nexora became more than a line of code, by the time it was an incorporated startup with seed funding, an actual office, and a team, I thought I had achieved what every engineer dreams of. My co-founders, Daniel and Priya, had come on board in the early days. Daniel was the business mind, good at wooing investors, with his slick presentations and his constant reminders that we were building the future. Priya was a brilliant developer in her own right, though she preferred the quiet work of back-end architecture over boardroom drama. We worked out of a cramped WeWork office in Palo Alto, surviving on takeout, and an almost religious dedication to our idea. In the first 18 months, we did the impossible. We closed a $5.6 million Series A with Castlon Ventures, a firm whose partners had been on the cap tables of some of the biggest names in tech. Our adaptive platform had already signed pilot programs with 3 Fortune 500 companies. Suddenly, the late nights and relentless coding sessions felt worth it. Investors came to shake my hand. Industry leaders quoted our white papers. We were on the verge of something monumental. But as the company grew, I noticed small shifts. Daniel started taking investor calls without me. Priya stopped attending our late-night design reviews, citing strategic realignment with product managers. I wasn't being copied on critical emails. My role as Chief Technology Officer began to feel ceremonial, even though I was still the one fixing core bugs at 3 a.m. When I asked about it, Daniel laughed it off, telling me not to worry, that I was the heart of the tech, and they needed me focused on engineering while he handled the big picture. It should have reassured me. It didn't. The unease grew in quiet moments. Board meetings where my input was politely ignored. Investor dinners, where Daniel introduced me as our brilliant engineer instead of co-founder. The last straw was the day our lead investor casually referred to Daniel as the founder of Nexora. My title, my role, my sweat equity, all of it seemed to be evaporating into thin air. I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding. I wanted to trust that we were still a team. But deep down, I knew something was shifting beneath my feet. And then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, it all came crashing down. The meeting wasn't even on my calendar. That should have been my first clue. I had arrived at the office around 8:15 a.m., still nursing the bitter aftertaste of a night spent debugging a critical memory leak in our API. I was barely in my seat when Daniel appeared at my door, his perfectly ironed shirt and hollow smile making me uneasy. "Can we grab a quick chat in the conference room?" His tone was almost apologetic, but his eyes weren't. When I walked in, Priya was already seated, staring at her phone like it was a lifeline. Beside her sat Thomas Kearney, Castlon Ventures' senior partner, a man I'd spoken to exactly twice since our Series A closed. He didn't even bother with a greeting, just offered me a stiff nod. My heart thudded. Daniel cleared his throat. "Alex, we've been doing some tough thinking about the direction of the company. With growth comes change. We need to make sure Nexora is structured for long-term success." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Thomas interjected smoothly, "that the board believes Nexora's next phase requires different leadership in technology. Your role as CTO will be transitioned out, effective immediately." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "Transitioned out?" I asked, my voice tight. "Are you firing me?" Daniel leaned forward, hands clasped, like some benevolent judge delivering mercy. "Alex, don't make this harder than it has to be. You've been incredible, vital. But your strengths are in innovation, not scaling. We need to bring in someone who can handle the enterprise demands Nexora is facing. I blinked. I built this company, from scratch. I wrote the code you're selling to Fortune 500 clients, and now I'm not qualified? Priya still wouldn't look at me. It's not personal, Daniel said, which of course meant it was deeply personal. We've arranged a generous severance package. Equity buyout. You'll walk away with more than most founders ever see. Buyout. That one word twisted in my gut. They weren't just removing me. They were erasing me. I had no illusions. Once I signed those papers, my name would be nothing more than a historical footnote in Nexora's origin story. You can't just force me out, I said, but even as I said it, I knew they could. My co-founders had maneuvered carefully over the past few months. Daniel had stacked the board with his allies. Priya, for whatever reason, guilt, ambition, had chosen to stand with him. And Caslon, of course, wanted a controllable CTO who wouldn't get in the way of their plans. Thomas slid an envelope across the table. The terms are outlined here. Review them with your attorney, but we'd like to wrap this up by Friday. My throat felt dry. I pushed the envelope back. You'll hear from my lawyer. Daniel sighed like a parent with an unruly child. Alex, don't burn bridges. Take the offer. Start something new. This is how the game works. I stood up, hands trembling. The game you're playing? I invented it! I walked out without another word. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the envelope. Anger, disbelief, humiliation. It all swirled together until it felt like I was drowning. I'd sacrificed everything for Nexora. I'd turned down offers from Google, Amazon, even Apple, to make this dream real. And now, I'd been pushed out of my own company like some disposable contractor. Friends tried to console me. This happens all the time in startups, one said. You'll bounce back. But it wasn't about bouncing back, it was about justice. It was about reclaiming what was stolen from me. I didn't sleep that night. Or the night after. But on the third night, somewhere between rage and exhaustion, I felt something shift inside me. A calm, cold clarity. They thought they'd buried me. They had no idea what I was about to build. The first week after they forced me out felt like free fall. I woke up at 4 a.m. every day with the same thought hammering in my head. They stole it. My code. My vision. My future. The papers they'd pushed across the table sat unopened on my kitchen counter. A silent accusation every time I walked past them. Lawyers told me the same thing in different words. Yes, I could sue, but the board's maneuvering was airtight. The contracts I had signed in the desperate days of pre-seed funding had left me exposed. I would spend years in court for the faint hope of a win. That wasn't justice. It was noise. I wanted something cleaner. Something they couldn't predict. On the 7th day, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not code, not yet, but plans. I listed everything Nexora had that I didn't. Capital, corporate contracts, my stolen algorithms. Then I listed everything I had that they didn't. The raw idea beneath the product. The intimate knowledge of its limitations. The flaws I had been patching at 3 a.m. that no one else even knew existed. And perhaps most importantly, a reputation in the industry as the architect of that technology. If they thought they'd erased me, they were wrong. I called in favors, quietly. I met with 2 trusted engineers from my early Nexora days, people Daniel had discarded in the name of, quote, efficiency. I met them in a coffee shop on El Camino Real, laptops open, the old energy sparking between us. I want to build something better, I told them. Something faster, smarter, with the same foundation, but none of the compromises they made to appease investors. Are you in? They didn't even hesitate. Next came the money. I wasn't foolish enough to think I could bootstrap a war with Caslon-funded Nexora on my savings. But I also knew investors. Real investors, the kind who understood vision, had been following my work since the early white papers. I reached out to 10 of them. Carefully crafted pitches explaining what had happened and what I intended to build. By the end of the month, 5 had agreed to seed my new company, not just because they believed in the product, but because they believed in me. One of them, a veteran VC named Evelyn Cho, said something I would never forget. People invest in founders, Alex. They just forgot that. Let's remind them. I called the company Aperion Systems, a name that meant boundless. Unlike Nexora, which had pivoted toward enterprise bureaucracy, Aperion would focus on modular, adaptive architecture for small to mid-sized businesses, an underserved market with massive potential. It was a calculated move. Daniel would be so busy scaling Nexora for Fortune 500 clients that he wouldn't even see me coming until it was too late. And I wasn't just building a competitor, I was building an upgrade. I revisited every design decision we'd compromised on to keep Caslon happy, stripped down functionality for investor-friendly timelines, bloated integrations for Fortune clients, the analytics module we had shelved entirely because Daniel thought it was, quote, too experimental. I put them all back in. My small team and I worked like our lives depended on it, because in a way, they did. Every night ended the same way it had in my Nexora days. Empty coffee cups, whiteboards filled with diagrams, that obsessive hum of creation. But I wasn't just coding. I was watching. I kept tabs on Nexora through public filings, industry chatter, and ex-employees who had no loyalty to Daniel's empire. I saw the cracks forming. Their scalable infrastructure was bleeding costs. Their new CTO was a corporate puppet with no real understanding of the underlying system, and their obsession with big clients had left them vulnerable to a nimble competitor. I also studied Caslon Ventures, their portfolio, their debt obligations, their limited partners. I wanted to understand them as much as I understood my former co-founders. Because I didn't just want to compete with Nexora. I wanted to dismantle their foundation. It was almost poetic. The company they stole from me would become the blueprint for the company that would destroy them. One night, around 2 a.m., I caught myself staring at Aperion's roadmap, feeling something I hadn't felt since the early Nexora days, that fire, that dangerous hope. But this time, it was sharper. More deliberate. Daniel had once told me, this is how the game works. Fine. I'd play the game. But I'd play it better than they ever could. The launch of Aperion Systems wasn't the explosive reveal that Daniel would have orchestrated. No flashy press releases. No contrived TED-style presentations about disrupting the future. I chose something quieter. Sharper. We went live with a pilot program for 7 carefully selected clients. Companies that needed what Nexora couldn't provide anymore. Agility, customization, direct access to the people building their systems. I wrote personal letters to each CEO. No generic marketing fluff. Just a founder speaking directly to another leader about solving their real problems. Within 2 months, we had traction. Not vanity metrics. Real. Paying customers whose operational costs dropped by nearly 38% within the first quarter. Our adaptive layer didn't just integrate with their existing systems, it learned from them, iterating in real time without costly consultant interventions. That was the difference between Nexora and Aperion. They had sold a static product. We were selling evolution. I hired slowly and deliberately. Every person who joined us had skin in the game, literally. Instead of bloated salaries and corporate perks, they got meaningful equity and full creative ownership over their work. It created an atmosphere Daniel could never buy, a team that believed in what we were building because it was theirs too. Evelyn Cho became more than an investor. She became my shield and my sword. She introduced me to a network of operators and venture partners who didn't just write checks, but opened doors. Doors that led to funding rounds Nexora's board didn't see coming. By the end of our first year, we closed a $15 million Series A with Ardent Capital, a firm Caslon Ventures had been trying to woo for years. It wasn't just capital. It was symbolic. And then the real fun began. I knew Daniel. I knew his ego. He couldn't resist press. So when TechStream ran an article titled, "The Founder They Tried to Erase Is Back," and beating Nexora at its own game, I knew he'd read every word. And when Forbes profiled me as a, quote, visionary engineer reclaiming the startup space, I knew it would make him furious. I didn't care about vanity. But I wanted him to feel the shift. To know the person he thought he'd buried was now standing on ground he couldn't reach. Meanwhile, Nexora was floundering. Their, quote, enterprise-focused roadmap had turned their platform into a lumbering beast, pleasing no one. Their CTO couldn't solve the growing instability issues in their core architecture. Clients started whispering, and then calling us. That's when I made my boldest move yet. We launched Aperion Edge, a lightweight module designed specifically to migrate systems from Nexora's infrastructure to ours, with minimal downtime. It was the one thing I'd sworn I wouldn't do, go directly after their customers. But by then, it wasn't just strategy, it was survival. The backlash was immediate. Daniel called me personally, his voice dripping with full civility. Alex, this is low, he said. No, I replied calmly. This is business. Caslon Ventures fired back too. Their legal team sent us a cease and desist, claiming intellectual property theft. I had been waiting for that. My lawyers dismantled their claims in less than a week. They had forgotten one inconvenient fact. I had built the original architecture before Nexora was even incorporated. They didn't own my brain. Still, I didn't want a public war. Not yet. So we countered quietly, aggressively. Evelyn connected me with two of Caslon's most dissatisfied limited partners, who were already questioning the firm's recent underperformance. They liked Aperion. They liked me. And within months, they made a move Caslon never saw coming. They offered to sell me their stakes in two of Caslon's smaller funds. At first, I didn't understand the significance. Then Evelyn explained it. This isn't just about funds, Alex. This gives you a seat at their table. You're buying leverage over the people who funded Daniel, the same ones who signed off on pushing you out. It felt poetic. The people who had erased me were now, unknowingly, helping me acquire the keys to their own house. By year 2, Aperion wasn't just surviving, we were thriving. Our revenue was on track to triple. Our name had weight. And quietly, behind the scenes, I was gathering the final pieces for the endgame. Because I didn't just want a better company, I wanted to own theirs. It began with an email. A simple, clinical announcement buried in Caslon Ventures' quarterly investor update. Caslon to restructure portions of its tech portfolio, divesting select high-risk assets. To most people, it meant nothing. To me, it was blood in the water. Through Evelyn's network, I had already pieced together Caslon's financial pressure. Their over-leveraged bets in two failing fintech startups had left them vulnerable. They needed liquidity. Fast. Which meant one thing. Nexora, my company, was now a candidate for restructuring. I waited. Timing was everything. 3 weeks later, I got the call I had been preparing for. Caslon was quietly shopping their stake in Nexora. They weren't advertising it, of course. Doing so would tank the startup's perceived value. But the right people knew, and through Evelyn, I was one of them. That night, I spread out the documents on my kitchen table. Caslon held a controlling 41% stake in Nexora. That was the company, really. Without them, Daniel was just a CEO with a fancy title and no safety net. But buying their stake outright wasn't feasible. Not even with our war chest from Aperion Series B. So we built a consortium. Evelyn worked the phones, bringing in two of Ardon's partners and a private equity firm hungry for exposure in adaptive systems. It took weeks of tense negotiations and sleepless nights, but eventually, the deal was on the table. Together, we would acquire Caslon's entire Nexora position. On paper, it was just a transaction. In reality, it was reclamation. The day the deal closed, I sat alone in my apartment for a long time. It wasn't celebration I felt. It was something heavier. 2 years ago, they had pushed me out like I was nothing. Now, through careful, patient moves, I owned them. And yet the most satisfying moment hadn't come. Not yet. That came a week later, in a conference room on the 19th floor of a San Francisco high-rise, overlooking a fog-draped bay, Nexora's quarterly board meeting. Daniel walked in late, of course, as if his ego could bend time. He froze when he saw me seated at the head of the table. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he forced a smirk. "Alex, to what do we owe the pleasure?" I gestured to the folder in front of me. "Daniel, meet your new majority stakeholder." The silence that followed was exquisite. Thomas Kearney, once so smug, so dismissive, wouldn't meet my eyes. Priya looked like she might be sick. Daniel finally spoke. This is highly irregular. Caslon no longer holds any stake in Nexora, I interrupted, keeping my tone even. Aperion, along with its partners, now controls their position. As of last night, I hold voting authority on those shares. Which means, I leaned forward slightly, I control this board. For once, Daniel didn't have a slick reply. He just stared, his jaw tight. It wasn't about gloating, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't savor the moment. It was about justice. Daniel, I said, you once told me not to burn bridges. You were right. I didn't burn them, I bought them. The next few hours were a blur of procedural motions and legalese, but the outcome was simple. Daniel was out. So was Thomas. Priya resigned before we could even discuss her position. By the end of the meeting, the same people who had erased me were gone, and I stood at the helm of the company they'd stolen. I didn't intend to merge Nexora into Aperion immediately. There was too much value in keeping them distinct, at least for now. But make no mistake, Nexora was mine again. And Daniel, he was history. Walking out of that boardroom, I felt lighter than I had in years. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about closure. I had built something better, stronger, and then used it to take back what was mine. The people who thought they'd written my ending had just learned the most important lesson of all. You don't erase someone who knows how to rewrite the story. 2 years? That's how long it took from the moment they pushed me out to the day I sat at the head of Nexora's boardroom, holding the company in my hands again. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder which part of the journey changed me more, the betrayal that ignited my fury or the patient, deliberate climb that followed. When I walked out of that conference room, after removing Daniel and his allies, I didn't fear the fireworks I'd expected. There was no triumphant music in my head, no cinematic slow-motion moment of glory. Instead, I felt quiet, steady, as though something inside me had finally aligned after years of being torn apart. Justice isn't loud, it's grounding. I kept Nexora intact, at least for now. I didn't want to destroy it. I wanted to restore it. Not as the Frankenstein's monster Daniel had turned it into, bloated with compromises and corporate fluff, but as the elegant, adaptive system I had envisioned when I first sketched it out on a whiteboard in my cramped apartment. Nexora's employees didn't need to pay for the sins of its leadership. Many of them had stayed because they believed in what we had built together. I owed them that much. Daniel never reached out to me after that day, neither did Priya, and I didn't chase them. They were chapters of my story, nothing more. What mattered was the team at Aperion, the one that helped me rebuild myself when I thought I'd been reduced to ashes. They had walked into an uncertain future with me and turned it into something extraordinary. People ask me now what my biggest takeaway is. Was it the importance of legal safeguards, of diversifying investor influence, of building slowly and intentionally? All of those are true. But if I had to distill it into one truth, it's this. They underestimated me because they thought they'd defined me. Daniel saw me as the brilliant engineer, a piece of machinery that could be replaced once the product worked well enough to impress the board. Caslon saw me as a risk to be managed, not an asset to be trusted. They thought they understood my ceiling, my limits, my willingness to play the game by their rules. What they didn't realize is that I was never playing their game. The day I stopped reacting to their betrayal and started quietly building my own path was the day I won. Not the day I bought Caslon's stake, not the day I removed Daniel. The real victory was the moment I realized I didn't need their permission to reclaim my story. If there's a moral to this, it's simple. Never let anyone convince you that your value is negotiable. Titles, shares, and board votes can be taken. But competence, vision, integrity, those are untouchable. They are the foundation you can rebuild from, no matter how thoroughly someone tries to erase you. I still work late into the night sometimes, staring at streams of code like I did in those early Nexora days. But now, I do it without fear, without that gnawing dread of being discarded. Because I know who I am. And I know this. If anyone tries to take what's mine again, I won't fight them on their terms. I'll do what I did before. LL, Build something bigger. And I'll take it all back. Moral: respect isn't given to those who shout the loudest or play the dirtiest. It's earned by those who stay true to their vision, even when others try to erase them. Never underestimate the quiet, strategic mind that refuses to quit. They don't burn bridges, they buy them.